September 5th of 1972, the day there was a massacre in Munich. The year of 1972 marked the return of the Olympic Games to a German city since the Berlin Games in 1936. On that occasion, Adolf Hitler had used this ceremony to display and propagate his Nazi ideology, causing the repudiation of all nations. It was for this reason that on this new occasion, West Germany's invitation was extended to many countries to mark a stark contrast with the 36 Games. In addition to this, the memory of what had happened in Mexico in 1968 weighed heavily on this new installment, where 10 days before the Games, hundreds of protesting students in Tlatelolco Square were killed by the police. That's why this time the organizers spent less than $2 million. On security, the idea was that those in charge of maintaining order would not have weapons, would not confront, and would not be dressed in a uniform that identified them. The 20th Olympics began on August 26, 1972. Thousands of athletes from over 120 countries celebrated the opening ceremonies of what the organizers had dubbed the Joyful Games. On this occasion, a figure who was very prominent and who would be involved in what would later be the Munich massacre. I'm talking about Dr. George Sieber. He had the ability to see the future through statistics. In the months leading up to the 1972 Olympics, the German organizers tasked Sieber, who was then a 39-year-old police psychologist, with organizing the event. What they called organization was assessing the worst possible scenarios. Sieber described a variety of possibilities that could well have been the outline of a detective novel. Kidnappers and hostages, superpower patterns, smuggled weapons, hijacked planes, and bombs. In studying the most desperate groups of that time, from the Irish Republican Army and the Palestine Liberation Organization to the Basque separatist group Euskadita Askatasuna and the very own Bader-Meinhof band from West Germany, he presented 26 cases, each one imagined and broken down with terrible details. Most of Sieber's scenarios focused on the Olympic Village, the symbolic global community, so to speak, of the Games. But on September 5th of 1972 at the Munich Olympics, history would not wait. The psychologist had presented to the organizers situation number 21, which contained the following details. At 5 in the morning, a dozen armed Palestinians would scale the perimeter fence of the village, invade the building housing the Israeli delegation, kill 1 or 2 hostages to impose discipline, then demand the release of prisoners held in Israeli jails and a plane to fly to some Arab capital. Even if the Palestinians failed to free their comrades, Sieber predicted they would turn the Games into a political demonstration and would be prepared to die. In no way could it be expected that they would surrender. There would only be one problem with these predictions that the psychologists had presented, and it would be the problem of the organization. They had decided that these games were going to be the games of freedom, the carefree games. They had discarded from the beginning the barbed wire, the police troops, or the armed police. Where Berlin in 1936 had been adorned with swastikas, Munich would present a logo uniting the whole world. They would show a new Germany with a much more humanitarian vision, and the security staff called Ollis should go completely unnoticed. The organizers then asked Sieber if he could review these predictions and present some new ones, a little less negative. Even so, they started the Mimos, jugglers, bands, and Waldi, the brand new Dachshund mascot, played through the Olympic Village while intruders without credentials would easily pass through its doors. To all this, the athletes had discovered that instead of walking a lot of meters to the main entrance to go to where their apartments were, where they rested, where they changed, where they had lunch, they could simply jump a wire fence of only 2 meters, so none of them bothered to go through the main door. Everyone made this jump to go to the place of their respective headquarters. The Hollies, the security forces, had learned to look the other way when this happened. But it was at this moment when Black September appeared. Black September was a militant separatist faction of the Palestinian organization Fatah. This group was founded in 1971, a year before the Olympic Games, to seek retaliation and assassinate King Hussein of Jordan. They chose the name Black September to commemorate the violent Palestinian clash during which thousands of Palestinians were killed or expelled from Jordan. Before its dissolution in 1974, the faction participated in many attacks against Israelis. The Black September commandos jumped the poor fence of only 2 meters. Just 50 minutes before what psychologist Sieber had predicted in his situation number 21. After that, they entered the ground floor of the Israelis. These, as Sieber had predicted, did not need to detonate the door that was open. The rest of the details, from the commandos' demands for a prisoner exchange and a plane to the change of venue from the athletic villa, even for the 2 Israelis killed in the early moments, would unfold with incredibly terrifying precision. They were camouflaged, dressed in sportswear, like any of the 7,134 athletes from the 121 participating countries in the inaugurated competition. They blended in easily, so much so that American athletes who had spent a night of drinks and celebrations upon seeing them helped them climb the wall without imagining that shortly after they would draw their weapons to kill the entire Israeli team. Once inside, they grouped with 3 other terrorists who were already there. The massacre began with 2 of the 20 Israeli delegation members. Weightlifter Joseph Romano and wrestling coach Moshe Weinberg were cold-bloodedly murdered, whose alarm allowed 9 of their colleagues to escape. Moshe tried to defend himself from the intruders with a kitchen knife, but it was of no use. When they woke me up, I thought it was a joke, recalls Shaul Latani, one of the survivors of the attack. He was the only Israeli athlete in the second bedroom, along with a couple of expert shooters who were allowed to keep their weapons and ammunition with them. He believes that this is what prevented the terrorists from entering that room. Instead, they went straight to the next room. Shaul Latani detailed how the entire sequence of the attack was from inside the building. Around 5:30 am, I was awakened by a colleague from the floor above, and he told me that Moshe Weinberg, the wrestling coach, had been killed by a terrorist. The first thing I thought was that it was a joke. When I opened my eyes and saw my roommate dressed, I realized it couldn't be a joke. That's when I understood that something bad was happening. I competed on September 3rd. The following day, my first day off since arriving in Munich, the entire delegation was invited in the afternoon. We attended a famous artists gala and went backstage. It was a beautiful moment. In fact, we took a group photo there with the main actor. It was the last photo of all of us as a group. I keep it with special affection. We returned to the hotel around midnight before the massacre at the Olympic Village occurred. Mollet asked for the alarm clock and I agreed to give it to him. But when I returned from the dining room, since I was very hungry, so I went to dinner alone. When I returned to the apartment around 1, I left him the alarm clock the last time I saw him. When my roommate woke me up, I left the bedroom. And I went down the hallway. I looked out onto the street. I wasn't aware of the danger. I noticed that in the building next door there was a man with dark skin, light clothing, and a weapon in his hand. I realized something was wrong. So I went to the second floor of my apartment, which was connected by a staircase to apartment 1. From there, we saw Moshe's blood. His body was lying there. I remember some of my companions said they wanted to take hostages, and we decided to leave. As I started to change, I saw someone walking on the balcony and realized that if I ran to escape, I could possibly be a target for this shooter. All this while I was putting clothes on over my pajamas. I was the last one to leave that apartment. 9 other Israelis were not so lucky and would become the bargaining chip. The demand for the release of the hostages was the liberation of 230 Palestinian prisoners in Israeli prisons and 2 left-wing German women. In addition to this, they demanded a plane to be able to escape to Egypt. Television imprinted in the viewer's memory a terrorist whose face was covered by a balaclava, peering out from a balcony in the light of the entire world. The same balcony that separated the killers from Dani, who was changing at that very moment. As the hours passed, 9 more Israelis had died, along with 5 terrorists and a Munich policeman. After a clumsy rescue attempt following the attack, the information and data was scattered throughout the first year, but there was something very important about this fact. And that is, they were able to interview the surviving terrorists, if you can say that. From a previous attack in France, this was added to the memoirs of the late leader of Black September, Abu Iyad, where he explained how he chose the 2 commands that led the attack on the Olympic Village. Isa, the terrorist who served as the main negotiator. And he became known to millions of viewers as the man in the white hat. And Tony, a Fedayeen, in other words a Palestinian guerrilla, or as they call themselves, a fighter for the faith, who was in charge of the operations. Then statements, espionage and more memories were added, from the High Command of Black September to clarify how this coup had been planned. A very interesting part of all this is that psychologist George Sieber, who resigned after all this happened, had foreseen this situation even before Black September planned it. The maneuver had not been planned until July 15th of that year, when Abu Daoud and Abu Diad joined another Black September leader named Abu Mohammed in a cafe in Rome. On the table was a report denying the requests of the Palestinian Youth Federation to allow Palestine to bring its own Olympic team to Munich. If they refuse to let us participate, why shouldn't we enter the Olympics in our own way? Asked Abu Mohammed. 2 days later, Abu Daoud was in Munich to carry out a reconnaissance of the Olympic Village, which was still under construction at that time. On August 7th, he returned with his team, and they established that the commandos could get through the fence surrounding the village by climbing over each other. But then one of us will be left behind, he pointed out. I'll be there to help the last of the men, said Abu Daoud. On August 24th, 2 days before the opening ceremonies, Abu Iyad flew from Algiers to Frankfurt with a male and female partner, plus 5 suitcases. The customs officials only opened the woman's bag and saw nothing more than underwear. Abu Daoud grouped up with Abu Iyad and his colleagues at a hotel in downtown Frankfurt, where they gathered the contents of the 5 suitcases, 6 Kalashnikov rifles, and 2 machine guns, in addition to cartridges with ammunition in 2 bags. Later that same day, Abu Daoud would take the weaponry by train to Munich, where they would store it in the train station lockers. Over the following days, Abu Daoud received 2 more AK-47s and several grenades. Throughout all this, he regularly moved the weapons from one locker to another, and returned once more to the Olympic Village, this time for a Syrian woman, a friend who was visiting a sister married to a professor in Munich, while a group of Brazilian athletes were returning from training. She told the guard in German, "My friend is Brazilian, and she just recognized an old schoolmate. Can we go in to say hello? It's only 10 minutes. The guard let them through. During that visit, she inspected the buildings of the Saudis and the Sudanese, and thus was able to get an idea of the layout of the Olympic Village housing. 2 days later, she returned to the village, but accompanied by her 2 terrorist companions. "My friends are upset with me," said Abu Daoud. "Yesterday I told them that I had been able to enter the village and meet our athletes." The friendly guard then allowed the 3 terrorists to pass. In his memoirs, Abu Daoud wrote, "It couldn't have started better, but the best was yet to come. 5 minutes later, we arrived in front of the Israeli building, and suddenly I saw a young tanned woman coming out of the door. They spoke to her and told her they were Brazilians who had always wanted to visit Israel. She accompanied them through the entrance, up the stairs, and through the ground floor of the duplex. Inside, the Palestinians took note of the details of each room, including the phone room, the televisions, and the view from each window. The woman had no way of knowing that she had greatly facilitated our task," writes Abu Daoud. "Now we knew that our first mission would be to take control of the ground floor of this apartment. There we would have control of all the main exits and also controlled access to the first floor and the basement. Once the building was taken, the commandos would regroup here with the kidnapped Israelis. Meanwhile, 6 young Palestinians selected from refugee camps in Lebanon were training in Libya, with emphasis on hand-to-hand combat and jumping from high walls. The Black September commanders told them they had been selected for an unspecified mission in a foreign country. Using fake passports, they converged in Munich in pairs shortly after the games began. Only on the eve of the attack did they meet and learn the details of their mission. That night, Abu Daud packed ammunition, grenades, food, and a first aid kit into 8 duffel bags, each adorned with Olympic rings. He also included nylon stockings for masks, ropes for tying up the hostages, and a supply of amphetamine called preludin, a stimulant to keep the men alert. At 9 p.m., they received the direct directives. The operation for which you have been chosen is essentially political. Capture these Israelis alive. No one can deny them the right to use their weapons in self-defense. However, only fire if you really have no other choice. It's not about killing your enemies, but about taking them as prisoners for future exchanges. The grenades are for later, to impress your German negotiating partners and defend ourselves to the death. To this he added something very important. From now on, consider yourselves dead, as dead in action for the Palestinian cause. They were given a canvas bag and sportswear with the name of the Arab nation. At some point after 3:30 in the morning, they took a taxi to the Olympic Village. When they approached the fence, they noticed American athletes coming back to the city laughing and drunk. Abu Daud urged his comrades to join them, to use the Americans as cover while they all climbed the fence. Our men not only mingled with the Americans, they also helped them. And they helped us. Hey, give me your bag. It was somewhat unreal to see the Americans helping Black September. Joseph Gottfrom, security for the Israeli team, apparently heard the downstairs door. After a while, seeing his door open, he could make out the barrels of several guns. He ran and threw his 132 kilos against the door and shouted, "Danger, guys, terrorists!" For a few seconds, Gottfrom managed to stop their entry, which allowed his roommate, the weightlifting coach Tubia Sokolovsky, to break a back window and flee to a safe place through the garden. But the terrorists leveraged their rifles and made their way in. Within seconds, they had good fruit on the ground. They quickly took out athletics coach Amit Surjapira and shooting coach Kehat Shor. From a ground floor bedroom, when they opened the door to another ground floor bedroom, wrestling coach Moshe Weinberg lunged at them with a kitchen knife, but another Fedayeen shot a bullet with his AK-47 that went through the side of Weinberg's mouth. The terrorists pushed their detainees down the duplex stairs and overpowered the remaining 2 occupants. They left the first group on the ground floor under surveillance. 5 terrorists, forcing a handkerchief into Weinberg's mouth, noticed a group of Israelis exiting another duplex onto the street. There they captured David Berger, a weightlifter from Ohio who had emigrated to Israel, another weightlifter named Joseph Romano who was on crutches due to a competition injury, and the wrestlers Eliezer Halfin, Mark Slavin, and Gad Sabari. Curiosity to see what was happening would lead them to captivity and later to their death. As soon as the terrorist group gathered, Sabari, one of the wrestlers, ran down the stairs and headed to the parking lot where he took cover behind the concrete post while a Palestinian shot at him. Weinberg tried to take advantage of the chaos and attacked one of the Fedayeen, freeing his weapon. Sabari escaped, but Weinberg could not. This was the first death of the massacre. The Black September Command drove their hostages to the second floor of that first duplex apartment. Romano, a weightlifter born in Libya and a 6-day war veteran, continued forward with his crutches until he grabbed an AK-47 that one of the terrorists had left at hand, but another Fedayeen shot him dead. A cleaning woman heading to work had called the Olympic security office at 4:47 to report that she had heard gunshots. An unarmed Oli, a security guard, was sent to 31500 colonist race and would find a hooded terrorist at the door. Within a few minutes, the Fedayeen would take Weinberg's body out to the street as a show of seriousness. At 5:08 a.m., 2 sheets of paper fell from the balcony into the hands of a policeman. The statement listed the names of 234 prisoners held in Israeli jails. In addition, in a gesture to win over European left-wing sympathy, they added to the request Andreas Bader and Ulrike Menhoff, the most notorious urban guerrillas in Germany. If people were not released by 9 in the morning, a hostage would be executed every hour, said Isa, one of the terrorists, to the police officer, and then we will throw their bodies into the street. Paradoxically, the Olympic Games continued as scheduled. At 8:15 a.m., an equestrian event took place, the Grand Prix of Classical Dressage, all as planned. To further distance itself from the Nazi era, the West German government strictly limited federal power, leaving the responsibility for internal security. Soon the news would come through Chancellor Willy Brandt responding to the demands of Black September. Under no circumstances will Israel make the slightest concession to terrorist blackmail. That position held firm for almost the entire day. On the other hand, the Germans, desperate to buy time, filled the Palestinians' ears with excuses. The Fedayeen knew from the start that it was very unlikely that Israel would agree to their demands, so they extended their deadline until noon. Isa would occasionally leave the building to converse with the German officials, usually with a grenade in his shirt pocket, and sometimes he would even pull the pin. The crisis team sought a plan. First, they offered the terrorists a large sum of money. Genscher, who would later become the public relations minister, appeared on the scene and pleaded with Isa not to subject the Jews to death once again on German soil and offered himself as a substitute. Vogel, Draver, Merck, and Walter Traeger, the ceremonial mayor of the Olympic Village, joined Genscher in that offer to replace the hostages, but Isa refused. The terrorists changed their deadline 2 more times, to 15 and then to 17 hours. With each delay, the television audience increased. The demand to free our imprisoned brothers only had symbolic value, Al-Gashey would say later. The sole aim of the action was to frighten the global public during their Happy Olympics and make them aware of the fate of the Palestinians. Late in the afternoon, they wanted to have 13 policemen infiltrate the building through the heating ducts. The plan had progressed so far that the police were already dressed in sports outfits and had loosened the roof ventilation grills, but this operation would fortunately be cancelled, as they discovered that the television crews were filming everything and broadcasting it live, not only for the people who were watching this hostage-taking around the world, but also for the terrorists themselves, who were following the news from the televisions. In the building they had hijacked before 5 in the afternoon, the terrorists made a new demand. They wanted a jet to go to Cairo with their compatriots. I didn't believe that the Israelis would negotiate with us in Germany, so we made a plan to take a plane and the hostages to another Arab country, clarified Aboud Aboud. From there, I believed they would negotiate the release of our prisoners. The already released Palestinians were supposed to be waiting on the Cairo runway at 8 in the morning the next day, Isa informed the Germans. Otherwise, Black September would execute the hostages before boarding the plane. These are innocent people, Genscher protested. Isa responded, I am a soldier, we are at war. But before moving forward, the Germans wanted to ensure 2 things, that the hostages were still alive and that they were willing to fly to Cairo. Genscher and Traeger were escorted to the 2nd floor room of the first apartment. The hostages told them that if they had to be driven through an Arab capital towards freedom, they would be willing to go. But the spokesperson for the hostages, Yor, a high-ranking member of the delegation, added that in such a case, they assumed that our government would comply with the terrorists' demands. Otherwise, we would all be dead. Isa had set a deadline at 21 hours and renewed her promise to kill a hostage for every hour the Germans took to present the plane. The Israeli government would never tolerate kidnapping. They were willing to leave the jet for the terrorists, but under no circumstances were they going to allow it to take off. The Germans then contemplated a final plan to free the hostages before they were helicoptered out of the Olympic Village. Sieber proposed placing armed police behind the concrete pillars of the garage. The police would stop the Fedayeen while they were taking the hostages from the complex to the helicopters, but Isa demanded that the transfer be by bus. Sometime later, the 17 captors and their hostages boarded 2 helicopters. By this point, the crisis team had little hope. We were 99% sure that we were not going to achieve our goal. We felt like doctors trying to bring the dead back to life. Draver had entrusted the operation to his assistant George Wolf, who had a new plan. The 2 helicopters would land about 100 meters from a Lufthansa 727 jet apparently ready to fly to Cairo. After the terrorists took their captives to the plane, and 17 police officers, some disguised as crew, would ambush them. All of this if the police snipers couldn't shoot clearly while the group crossed the runway. But the most tragic part of this plan is that 15 minutes after the helicopters landed, the police were very upset as they considered this to be a suicide mission. Most were going to be hidden in the back of the plane where they believed that a single terrorist grenade could incinerate them. As for the officers posing as pilots, they would be in the line of fire from the police in the back. Moreover, they were very unconvincingly disguised as they were given incomplete Lufthansa uniforms. The result was that they abandoned the mission. It was an inconceivable mutiny for an Israeli, but in West Germany, where you couldn't count on either soldiers or weapons, this was not madness. The helicopter pilots had flown through the sky to give the Germans time to prepare the assault and allow a third helicopter, carrying Schreiber, Grencher and Merck, to land before the others. "It's a terrible last-minute situation," Schreiber told Wolf. "What thing?" Wolf asked. "That there are 8 of them." Wolf had thought there were only 5 terrorists. The critical situation was that the snipers didn't know that the terrorists outnumbered them. At that moment, the plan was based solely on the precision of 5 shooters, none of whom had special training. They had all been chosen simply because they were good shots. 3 of them took positions in the control towers. A 4th had positioned himself on the asphalt behind a concrete nest. The helicopters landed at 10:35 at night. The 4 pilots and 6 Fedayeen exited. Meanwhile, other Black September members held the pilots at gunpoint. Isa and other terrorists approached to inspect the plane. Their suspicions, already aroused by the long helicopter transfer, were on high alert when they found the plane empty. Seeing that, they immediately ran back to the helicopters. Wolf then signaled to open fire. The shots filled the air for the first 4 minutes. With 6 visible terrorists, the snipers killed 2 of them and fatally wounded a 3rd, but the other 3, including Isa, had taken cover. While the pilots ran for cover, the surviving Palestinians from that first discharge hid behind the helicopters. The shooting continued until everything fell silent, and it lasted like this for a long and unsettling hour. Neither side made more than 1 or 2 shots. It was an ideal moment for a special weapons and tactics team to show up on the scene, but a special police unit landed at the other end of the airfield almost 2 kilometers from the action, and it never deployed. The biggest failure was not having enough sharpshooters. Ulrich Wegener would comment, the second failure was not having special forces that could attack the helicopters. Just before midnight, the transporters arrived to attack the helicopters. That's where they lost their lives. Of the hostages, a terrorist gunned down the 4 hostages inside a helicopter, killing Springer, Haffing and Seth Friedman and injuring Berger, then jumped to the ground and threw a grenade into the pilot's cabin before being shot dead as he was climbing up. Before the fire from that explosion reached the fuel tank and turned the helicopter into a hellfire, Isa came out of another helicopter with an AK-47 and gunned down the Germans. The police killed him and a second Fedayeen. Then, another terrorist commando wiped out the remaining 5 hostages, Gutfron, Shor, Slavin, Spitzer, and Shapira, with fatal shots. Fergal would be the final hostage killed. He had received 2 bullet wounds in the lower limbs and had survived that only to die from smoke inhalation. On the other hand, 3 practically unharmed Fedayeen were lying face down near that tremendous massacre. 2 of them were pretending to be dead. They were captured, and 40 minutes later, with the help of dogs, they found the last terrorist who was hiding under a railway wagon on the outskirts of the airfield. He opened fire, but was shot down during a brief shootout. The last shot, around 12:30 hours, ended nearly 3 hours of an operation that, as an involved official would later say, was doomed to fail. From the beginning to this day, the Germans never explained why they didn't deploy 2 or 3 snipers for each of the terrorists. The police also didn't have precision rifles, let alone bulletproof vests. The aerodrome was only moderately lit, so the police had set up 3 mobile lighting towers. But on that moonless night, the towers cast harsh shadows when Wolf was on the lighting tower. Had given the order to fire, only 3 armed men were in a position to hear him. The other 2 who were going to start shooting upon hearing gunfire were in the line of fire of their companions and had to first take cover. Only 3 policemen were left active to eliminate the 8 terrorists. Shaul Ladani, one of the survivors of this attack, commented on his opinion about the results of this operation. "I regret that the authorities have made decisions at random. The ideal place to release the hostages was the Olympic Village, or in the worst case, when they were about to board the helicopter to go to the airport. The Germans wanted to show the world that in the new Germany everything was beautiful, with flowers and colorful. They didn't want military action in front of the journalists who were in the village. The way they planned and executed everything was very disappointing." Willy Daum, president of the Munich organizing committee, initially wanted the rest of the games to be cancelled, but Brundage and others prevailed. "I also questioned the decision to continue," said former Mayor Vogel after the incident, "but over time I came to believe that we could not allow the Olympic Games to be stopped by terrorism." The height of the situation was that the authorities, in order not to provide information to the terrorists, lied by assuring that everyone was alive and toasting with their families, but the lie had to be unmasked at some point. The Olympic Games press chief Hans Klein informed the grim truth to journalist Jim McKay, who would later publicly comment, "I just received the latest information." Our worst fears have come true tonight. There were 11 hostages. 2 were killed in their rooms, 9 at the airport tonight. They're all gone. On the same September 6th, the mournful Heroic Symphony by Beethoven was played by the Munich Philharmonic Orchestra in a tribute held in memory of the victims at the Olympic Stadium. The idea that the show must go on prevailed. The Olympics continued the next day. There was no time to mourn the dead. The Games resumed under an incredible situation. Many of the 80,000 people who filled the Olympic Stadium for the West Germany vs Hungary football match were carrying rattles and waving their flags, while the authorities did nothing to intervene on behalf of those fallen due to terrorism. However, several spectators unfurled a banner that read, "17 dead, already forgotten." As could be expected, security agents seized the sign and expelled the offenders from the venue. There is a protocol where each Olympics and its organizers must publish an official comprehensive report on everything that happened at the event. The one from Munich was one of the most complete. It begins with praises for Mark Spitz for his feats in the pool, Olga Korbut for the medals won on the mats, and the informal Olympic Village for its contribution to the relaxed spirit of the Games. In addition, it recounts the atrocities perpetrated against the members of the Israeli delegation in mostly exculpatory neutral prose, only to then add this grotesque opinion. After the terrible events of September 5, 1972, it was again the atmosphere of the Olympic Village that greatly contributed to calming and preserving peace among the athletes. In the negligence lawsuit, the victims' families argued that the Germans should have anticipated some attack. As if what George Sieber had premeditated in the plan wasn't enough, Black September had organized 5 operations in Europe during the previous 10 months, including 3 in West Germany. The families also alleged that German intelligence had received at least 3 reports between August 21st and September 2nd of Palestinian terrorists approaching the region. At the beginning of 2001, the Germans finally reached an agreement with the families, offering a compensation of $3 million to be paid in equal thirds by the Munich government. In addition to the agreement, they are still waiting for an expression of remorse or responsibility. If only they would tell us we tried. We didn't know what we were doing. We didn't want what happened to happen. We're sorry. That would be the end, says Ankie Spitzer, the widow of the fencing coach murdered in the massacre. But they didn't even say that. Sieber has not worked with the sports event organizing committee again. It's just frustration, he said. Officials can't develop a tradition because they are all rookies. 9 out of 10 don't get paid, they are volunteers, and the paid professional can't direct them. This disaster in Munich was a horror, a chain of big and small catastrophes. Who paid? The German government paid. But of the individuals who were responsible, no one did. We can't change the past. But the most important thing is to highlight and learn that this doesn't serve for the future because everything is always different. Munich forever changed the way the Olympic Games were conducted. The athletes of the 1980 Winter Games in Lake Placid stayed in a village built so safe that it eventually became a prison. Later that same year, in Moscow, the Soviets took X-rays of every piece of luggage that arrived at the airport and deployed 240,000 military personnel to show they were serious. For the Los Angeles Olympics, they introduced remote-controlled robotic devices to examine suspicious objects. To help Athens prepare for 2004, security experts from Australia, Great Britain, France, Germany, Israel, Spain, and the United States were collaborating with the Olympic organizers and Greek authorities. The subsequent Olympic Games that followed were increasingly reinforced in terms of civil and political security matters. On the other hand, the Israeli government mounted a special forces operation whose mission was to locate and eliminate those responsible for the attack. They named it the Wrath of God, but that's another story. Clearly nothing was the same after the events of September 5th, 1972, the day there was a massacre in Munich. And that's it for today's video. I hope you found what I told you interesting. If you did, please leave a like, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. I also recommend a couple of videos to watch here on the channel. My name is Magnus Mephisto, and this is the day that